When a smug TV host mocks Melania Trump's cross necklace on live television, he expects an easy takedown. But what happens next leaves him speechless. With unwavering grace and sharp conviction, Melania delivers a response so powerful that it stuns the audience and shakes the nation. Watch as she turns humiliation into victory in the most unexpected way. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The air inside the Spotlight's television studio was thick with anticipation. The countdown to live broadcast ticked away, and producers buzzed around like hornets, adjusting lights, double-checking audio levels, and ensuring the cameras were perfectly aligned. Tonight wasn't just another episode. It was a spectacle in the making. Jack Calloway, the show's notorious liberal host, straightened his tie in the mirror, his signature smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. This was his stage, his battleground, and tonight's guest was the perfect opponent. Melania Trump was known for her elegance and reserved demeanor, a stark contrast to the sharp, biting tone that Jack wielded like a weapon. His producers had drilled one thing into him before he stepped under the blinding lights: push hard, make her uncomfortable, get the reaction. After all, controversy meant ratings, and ratings meant power. Beyond the studio doors, the audience gathered, murmuring with curiosity and excitement. Many were regulars, devout fans of Calloway's unfiltered, often ruthless take on politics and culture. They had seen him eviscerate politicians, celebrities, and public figures with surgical precision. Some were here for the sheer sport of it, eager to see him break Melania down, force her into a corner where she would stammer, falter, or, if he was lucky, storm off in frustration. But Melania was not the kind of woman who stormed off. Backstage, in a dimly lit dressing room, Melania Trump sat before a large vanity mirror, her reflection calm, composed, unwavering. She adjusted the delicate golden cross necklace that rested just above her collarbone, a simple but powerful symbol of her faith. She knew what Jack Calloway was planning. She could almost hear his smug, sarcastic tone before he even spoke, the way he would frame his words like daggers disguised as questions. He wasn't interested in her answers. He was interested in a performance, a public takedown. A producer knocked on the door. "Mrs. Trump, we're ready for you." She took a breath, letting her fingers graze the cross one last time before standing. Unlike Jack, she wasn't here to fight. She wasn't here for applause or headlines. She was here because she had a responsibility, not just as the First Lady, but as a woman of conviction, as someone who had been tested, ridiculed, and underestimated time and time again. As she walked down the narrow hallway, security flanking her on either side, she felt the weight of millions of eyes, some watching in admiration, others waiting for her to fail. The studio doors swung open, the blinding lights, the deafening applause, the waiting stage, and at the center of it all, Jack Calloway, grinning like a predator sensing its prey. This was it. As Melania Trump stepped onto the stage, the atmosphere in the studio shifted. The applause, though warm, carried an underlying tension. Some clapped in admiration, others in anticipation of what was to come. Jack Calloway leaned back in his chair, one leg casually crossed over the other, his expression a blend of amusement and condescension. He had done this 100 times before. He thrived on confrontation, and tonight he was certain he would break her down like he had so many before her. Melania took her seat opposite him, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. The lights overhead burned hot, casting dramatic shadows across the sleek, modern set. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion, every micro-expression that could be twisted into a viral soundbite. Jack flashed his signature smirk and turned toward the audience, already crafting the narrative in his mind. The powerful First Lady, cornered by hard-hitting truth. He adjusted the stack of papers in front of him, though he hardly needed them. He had already decided exactly how this was going to play out. "Mrs. Trump," he began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "Welcome to the spotlight. I have to say it's quite the honor. We don't often get guests of your, shall we say, stature here." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Jack let the moment linger before leaning in, his voice dropping just slightly, as if he were letting her in on some great secret. "Now, before we get into policy and all the usual talking points, I have to ask something that's been on a lot of people's minds lately." He gestured vaguely toward her chest, where her gold cross necklace gleamed softly under the studio lights. "That's quite a statement piece you're wearing. Bold choice for a first lady in today's America, wouldn't you say?" The audience reacted with scattered murmurs, some laughing, others shifting uncomfortably. Melania's fingers instinctively brushed against the cross, but she didn't flinch. She didn't shift in her seat or look away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying Jack with an almost amused curiosity. "A bold choice," she repeated, her accent wrapping around the words with quiet deliberation. Jack nodded, feigning innocence. "Well, you have to admit, in a country that values inclusivity, a national figure wearing such an overt religious symbol, it's a bit, what's the word, exclusionary?" He leaned back, folding his hands together as though he had just landed a brilliant point. The audience tensed. The challenge had been made. For the first time, Melania smiled. Not a forced, diplomatic smile, but one filled with knowing confidence. She let the moment breathe, allowing the weight of his words to settle before she responded. "This," she said, lifting the cross gently between her fingers, "is not a statement of exclusion. It is a symbol of my faith, my beliefs, my strength." Her voice was calm, yet it carried an unmistakable weight, a quiet authority that made even the most skeptical listener lean in. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "I understand personal faith, Mrs. Trump, truly. But you're not just anyone. You represent all Americans. Muslims, Jews, atheists, Buddhists. Shouldn't a first lady be more neutral?" Melania's smile didn't waver. If anything, it deepened. "Neutral?" she echoed. "So you believe freedom means hiding what we believe? That inclusivity means erasing personal conviction?" Jack hesitated for half a second, just a fraction of a moment, but it was enough. Melania seized the opening, her voice steady, unwavering. "The First Amendment of the United States Constitution was ratified in 1791, she continued, her gaze locked onto his. "It protects the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion. It ensures that no American, no matter how powerful or how small, is ever told they must hide their beliefs." A murmur ran through the audience. Jack's smirk twitched, faltering at the edges. Yes, he said, waving a dismissive hand. "But surely you can see how a national leader openly displaying a religious symbol could be seen as alienating to—" "Alienating to whom?" Melania interrupted, her tone still smooth but sharp as a blade. "To people who believe in freedom. To those who cherish their right to express what they believe in, just as I cherish mine." Jack's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The audience held their breath. "You, Jack," she said, her voice dropping just slightly, making the moment even more intimate, more unshakable, "have the right to sit here, to mock, to belittle, to question me. That is your freedom. But understand this, I have the same right to believe." Silence fell over the studio like a thick fog. Jack's smirk had vanished entirely. His fingers tapped nervously against the desk. He had expected defensiveness, maybe a flustered attempt at deflection. He had expected to control the conversation, to steer it where he wanted. But Melania had done something far more dangerous to him. She had spoken the truth. From the corner of the room, a single clap echoed, then another, and another. Suddenly the entire audience was on their feet, roaring in applause. Jack Calloway, the man who had torn down so many with snide remarks and clever jabs, sat frozen, his world tilting beneath him. He had walked into this expecting to humiliate the First Lady of the United States. Instead, she had humbled him before the entire nation. The thunderous applause reverberated through the studio, drowning out even the hum of the cameras and the shuffling of production assistants behind the scenes. It was an unexpected moment, one that Jack Calloway, for all his years of experience in the cutthroat world of televised debate, had not anticipated. He had walked into this interview believing he would tear Melania Trump down, expose her as weak, force her into an uncomfortable silence. But now, as the audience stood in admiration for the First Lady, it was he who sat in silence. He was the one scrambling for control. Jack forced out a chuckle, his fingers curling around the armrests of his chair. His mind raced. He needed to regain his composure, needed to turn this moment around before it was too late. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the reality before him. She hadn't played his game. She had refused to engage in a petty back and forth. Instead, she had stared him down, armed with nothing but truth and conviction, and won. As the applause finally died down, Jack cleared his throat, straightened his posture, and forced a smug grin back onto his face. "Well, Mrs. Trump," he said, voice just slightly strained, "I must say, I didn't expect such a passionate defense of jewelry." A few uneasy chuckles scattered through the audience, but the energy had shifted. Jack could feel it in the way the crowd wasn't laughing with him anymore, the way they were leaning toward Melania, not him. Melania didn't react to his attempt at condescension. Instead, she folded her hands gracefully in her lap and looked at him with something far more powerful than anger. Pity. "This," she said, once again touching the golden cross resting above her heart, "is not just jewelry, Mr. Calloway. And you know that." Jack tensed. "You know it," she repeated, her voice quieter now but heavier, more piercing than before. "That is why you mock it. That is why it bothers you." For the first time, Jack didn't have a response. The words had hit something deep inside him, something he had buried long ago. The cameras captured everything. The audience sat frozen in anticipation. There was an unspoken question hanging in the air. What would he say now? Jack's jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment he thought about ending the segment early. His producers were already speaking frantically into his earpiece, their voices a blur of desperate suggestions. Steer the conversation away, change the topic, cut to commercial. But he knew it wouldn't work, not this time. Instead, he leaned forward, his smirk returning, forced but still present. "All right, Mrs. Trump," he said, feigning amusement. "Since we're talking about faith, let's address something else. You claim to be a champion of American values, yet your husband has been called divisive, even dangerous by many. Some say he has damaged this country, not strengthened it. How do you defend that?" Gasps rippled through the audience. A bold pivot, one meant to put Melania back on the defensive, to turn the tide of the conversation. But Melania didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a soft breath, as if she had expected this, as if she had prepared for this exact moment. She looked directly into Jack's eyes. "You see, Jack," she said, voice steady as steel, "this is the real game." Jack's expression faltered for a split second. "You did not invite me here to discuss policy or initiatives," Melania continued, her gaze unwavering. "You did not bring me here to have an honest conversation with the American people." She tilted her head slightly. "You invited me here to destroy me." Silence. Heavy. Unbreakable. The audience felt the truth in her words before she even finished speaking. Jack shifted in his seat. "That's not..." Melania didn't let him finish. "And yet," she said, voice softer now, yet brimming with confidence, "I am still here. My faith is still here. And the only thing that has been broken tonight, Jack," she let the moment stretch, let the tension build, "is your narrative." The studio erupted into cheers. Jack clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could feel it, the power slipping away. This was supposed to be his moment. He was supposed to win. But instead, something unthinkable was happening. He was losing. And worse, he was beginning to question why he even wanted to win. The audience, the crew, even the people watching at home, they all saw it now. Jack Calloway, the man who had built his career on tearing others down, was now sitting face to face with something he couldn't shake. Conviction, faith, truth. And suddenly it wasn't about Millennium anymore. Suddenly it was about him. The emotions stirred deep inside him, uncomfortable and raw. A part of him wanted to fight back, to regain control, but another part, one he barely recognized, wanted to listen. Melania saw it. She could see the war waging inside him. And so, in a voice filled with nothing but kindness, she leaned forward and asked him the one question he had spent his entire career running from. "Jack, why does faith bother you so much?" Jack froze. His throat tightened. His fingers twitched. His entire world, the world he had carefully constructed, one built on mockery and cynicism, one that had no place for faith or conviction, began to crack. He tried to laugh, tried to brush it off, but the words wouldn't come. His mother's voice flashed in his mind, a long-buried memory of her kneeling by the bed, whispering prayers. His childhood home, the small wooden cross on the wall. His father's worn Bible, the pages dog-eared and marked with notes. Jack had walked away from all of it. And yet, now, with millions watching, with Melaniatrump sitting across from him, unwavering in her own belief, he realized something that sent a chill through his entire being. Maybe he had never really walked away. Maybe he had just been running. And now, for the first time in decades, he wasn't sure he wanted to run anymore. The cameras kept rolling, the audience waited. And Jack Calloway, the man who always had a cutting remark, a perfect comeback, an unshakable confidence, had nothing left to say. The silence in the studio was deafening. Jack Calloway sat frozen, staring at melaniatrump across the sleek glass table. Millions of viewers were still glued to their screens, waiting for the host's signature snarky retort, but there was none. The man who had built his career on arrogance and mockery was suddenly at a loss for words. For the first time in his life, Jack didn't know how to fight back. His fingers twitched against the desk, his lips parted, but no sound came out. His mind was a battlefield, a war between the man he had spent years becoming and the boy he used to be, the one who once believed in something greater than himself, before cynicism took over. Melania didn't press him. She didn't smirk or gloat. Instead, she watched him with a quiet understanding, as if she had seen this moment coming long before he had. "Jack," she said softly, her voice cutting through the thick tension like a blade, "do you remember what it felt like to believe in something?" Jack flinched. He felt the weight of the question settle in his chest like a stone. The audience sat in rapt anticipation, leaning forward, their breaths shallow. No one had ever seen Jack Calloway like this. Not his viewers, not his producers, not even himself. Finally, he let out a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." The words were so foreign coming from him, so vulnerable, that the entire room seemed to shift. The cameras, the bright lights, the script he had written in his mind, none of it mattered anymore. Melania nodded, as if she had expected that answer. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, her golden cross still gleaming under the harsh studio lights. "You once did," she said. "We all did." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. Maybe. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Melania studied him for a long moment, then gently asked, "What happened, Jack?" A cold chill crawled down his spine. What happened? He wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question, but no part of him could, because he knew exactly what had happened. He had let the world harden him. He had once believed in faith, in good people, in something bigger than himself. But then came the disappointments, the betrayals, the moments that shattered his innocence, one piece at a time. He had watched his mother clutch her cross and pray for help that never came. He had listened as his father's voice cracked under the weight of hopelessness. He had grown up seeing faith as a crutch for the weak, a false hope that led to nothing but heartbreak. So, he abandoned it. He built a career on mocking conviction, tearing down those who still clung to it, convincing himself that he was better off without it. And yet here he was, sitting across from a woman who refused to let him run anymore. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Faith didn't do anything for me," he muttered, but even he could hear the weakness in his own voice. Melania tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" Jack's chest tightened. His producers were screaming in his earpiece now, telling him to cut to commercial, to regain control of the interview, to do something, anything to salvage the situation. But for the first time in his career, he ignored them. Instead, he let the silence settle. And then, in a voice so low it was almost lost under the studio lights, he admitted the one thing he had never dared to say out loud. "I don't know how to believe anymore." Gasps rippled through the audience. Jack Calloway, the man who had spent decades mocking faith, humiliating believers, tearing apart everything they stood for, had just admitted his own emptiness. Melanie's eyes softened, but she didn't rush to fill the silence. She let the moment breathe, let it sink in. Then, with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the entire interview, she spoke. "Faith isn't about having all the answers, Jack." Jack swallowed hard. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. Melania continued, her voice steady. "It's about choosing to believe even when you don't have them. It's about trusting that there's something bigger than your pain, bigger than your doubts." Jack's fingers curled into fists. Something about her words hit too close to home. All his life he had prided himself on being in control, on knowing how to cut people down before they could cut him first. But now, for the first time, he was the one being laid bare, and it terrified him. Melania leaned forward just slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But faith doesn't demand perfection, Jack. It only asks that you take the first step." A lump formed in Jack's throat. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The cameras were still rolling, millions of people were watching, and yet, for the first time in his life, he didn't care. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't performing. He was just Jack. And Jack was finally starting to question everything he thought he knew. The audience sat frozen, watching a man unravel before their very eyes. And as Jack Calloway sat there, staring at a simple golden cross shining under the lights, he realized something that shook him to his core. Maybe faith wasn't the weakness he thought it was. Maybe, just maybe, it was the only thing strong enough to save him. The air in the studio was suffocating. The bright lights that once felt empowering now burned against Jack Calloway's skin, exposing him in a way he had never imagined possible. The silence stretched unbearably, the weight of Melaniatrump's words pressing down on him like an anvil. All his life, he had believed he had control over his career, his reputation, the narrative he spun every night. But not tonight. Tonight, he was the one being torn apart. Jack's breath came unevenly, his pulse pounding in his ears. He could hear the chaos buzzing in his earpiece, the producers frantically demanding he take back control, salvage what little was left of his credibility. But he knew the truth. There was nothing left to salvage. His audience, the very people who had cheered him on night after night, had turned against him. And Melania, she wasn't just a guest anymore. She was a force, a woman who had walked into his arena and turned it against him with nothing but quiet, unshakable faith. Jack Calloway, the man who had spent years mocking, sneering, and humiliating, was completely and utterly defeated. But it wasn't just about this interview. This was about something far deeper. A part of him, the part that had spent years burying, rejecting, and suppressing anything that reminded him of faith, was breaking open. And the raw truth of it terrified him. Melania sat still, watching him carefully, as though she could see everything unraveling inside him. Her golden cross gleamed under the harsh lights, the symbol of everything he had tried to mock. And yet, in this moment, it wasn't something to ridicule. It was something he couldn't look away from. Jack swallowed hard. "I don't know how to believe anymore," he had admitted. And somehow those words had felt heavier than any insult, any attack, any moment of rage or triumph he had ever experienced. Melania's expression softened, but there was no pity in her eyes. only understanding. "Faith isn't about knowing all the answers, Jack," she said, her voice steady. Jack blinked, his throat tightening. He had spent years thinking faith was weakness. Yet here she was, the strongest person in the room. Jack let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "You make it sound so simple." Melania's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "It is simple," she said, "but simple isn't the same as easy." Jack exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. How had it come to this? Just an hour ago, he had been confident, prepared, ready to humiliate her on live television. And now? Now he felt like a man standing at the edge of something terrifyingly unknown. His gaze flickered to the audience, many of them in tears, hands clasped, hanging onto every word Melania spoke. He had lost them, not because she had outwitted him, but because she had spoken a truth he could no longer deny. Jack let out a slow, unsteady breath. His entire life he had told himself that faith was a lie people told themselves to feel safe. But what if the real lie had been his own disbelief? What if all the cynicism, the anger, the arrogance had been a shield? What if he had been wrong all along? Jack's stomach twisted. His entire career, his entire identity, had been built on the idea that he knew better than everyone else. That faith was for fools. That conviction was a weakness. And yet, here he was, broken before a woman who had never once raised her voice. A lump formed in his throat. He could feel something inside him, something he had spent years suppressing, begin to stir. And for the first time, he was afraid of what it meant. Melania's gaze held his, unwavering. "Faith isn't about perfection, Jack," she said. "It's about finding your way, even when you've been lost for a long time." Jack flinched. Lost. The word hit him harder than he expected, because that was exactly what he was. Lost. He had spent years laughing at others, tearing them down, telling himself that he was in control. But he wasn't. He never had been. Jack let out a shaky breath, gripping the desk. He could feel his entire world shifting, his carefully constructed walls crumbling around him. And yet, for the first time in his life, he didn't want to rebuild them. He wanted to understand. He wanted to believe. But how? How did someone like him, someone who had spent years rejecting faith, find his way back? Jack's hands trembled. He looked at Melania, his voice raw, broken. "How do you start?" Melania smiled, a warm, genuine smile that held no judgment, no mockery, no condescension. "By letting go," she said simply. Jack inhaled sharply. Letting go of his pride, of his anger, of the fear of being wrong. It sounded so easy, but it was the hardest thing he had ever considered doing. The audience was silent, waiting. The cameras were still rolling. Millions of people were watching history unfold. Jack Calloway, the man who had mocked faith his entire career, was standing at a crossroads. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could take another step without something greater than himself guiding the way. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He exhaled slowly, then, for the first time in his life, he did something completely unscripted. He reached up, touched the spot where his mother's cross had once rested on her chest, and then, in front of millions of people, Jack Calloway lowered his head. A single tear slipped down his cheek, and in that moment, everything changed. The world seemed to stand still as Jack Calloway sat frozen in his chair, his entire existence unraveling before millions of people. The audience watched, enraptured, as the once unshakable television host, a man who had built his career on tearing people down, on arrogance, on cynicism, was now coming undone in real time. His hands trembled against the desk, his carefully polished persona fracturing under the weight of melaniatrump's unshakable presence. Jack had spent his life dismissing faith, scoffing at conviction, and wielding his words as weapons against those who dared to believe in something greater than themselves. And yet here he was, crushed by the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be shaken. The studio hummed with tension as the camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion that crossed Jack's face. Melania Trump sat still, serene yet powerful, her golden cross gleaming under the stage lights. A symbol that, just minutes ago, he had ridiculed. Now, he couldn't look away from it. For the first time in his life, he felt small. For the first time in his life, he questioned everything. Jack had mocked faith for years, but what if faith was never the problem? What if the problem had always been him? A lump rose in his throat as he realized something painfully true. He had spent years hiding behind his cynicism because it was easier than admitting he had lost something precious. And Melania Trump, she had just exposed it all. Jack's throat tightened, his mind racing as he struggled to grasp what was happening inside him. His whole life had been built on control, and now he had none. His audience was no longer laughing. His producers were no longer shouting orders. And the cameras? They were broadcasting his humiliation to the world. But strangely, for the first time, he didn't care. Jack let out a shuddering breath, his fingers gripping the desk like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. Who am I? The thought slammed into him like a freight train. He had spent years shaping his identity as the man who didn't believe, the man who knew better, the man who could destroy anyone with a single segment. But tonight, staring at Melania Trump's unwavering gaze, he saw himself for what he really was. A man who had lost himself long ago. The air in the studio was thick, suffocating. The audience sat motionless, waiting for his next words. Even the control room, where panic had erupted among the producers, had gone silent. And then, something unthinkable happened. Jack Calloway, the man who never faltered, the man who never backed down, the man who never showed weakness, bowed his head. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The camera zoomed in. Even Melania Trump's expression softened, as if she knew this moment had nothing to do with winning or losing. This was something far deeper. Jack's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. The audience held their breath. Jack looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, filled with something unfamiliar, something real. "I've spent my whole life tearing people down for believing in something," he said, his voice cracking. "But maybe I was wrong." Another gasp swept through the studio. Jack Calloway, the face of modern cynicism, had just admitted defeat. Not just to Melania, not just to the audience, but to himself. Melania Trump's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Not one of triumph, but of understanding. "Belief isn't about being perfect, Jack," she said. "It's about finding your way back home." Jack's breath hitched. Home. It was such a simple word, yet it held a weight he hadn't felt in years. Because the truth was, he had been running. Running from faith. Running from memories of his mother, who had clutched her cross in times of pain. Running from the guilt that gnawed at him late at night, the guilt that whispered, "You lost something, Jack, and you never tried to get it back." Tears burned behind his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't fight them. Jack exhaled sharply, pressing a hand over his mouth. This wasn't just a debate he had lost. This was his soul cracking open, and he had no idea how to put the pieces back together. The silence in the studio dragged on, every second feeling like an eternity. The audience wasn't just watching a TV moment anymore. They were witnessing something deeply human, deeply raw. Somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered, "We've lost the show." But they hadn't lost the show. They had lost Jack Calloway, the version of him that existed before tonight. Jack swallowed hard, turning to Melania. For once, he had no clever comebacks, no sarcastic remarks, no scripted lines. Just one question: how do I fix this? Melania smiled, kind and patient. "You start by listening," she said. Jack nodded, a slow, hesitant nod. And then, for the first time in his entire career, he did something completely unprecedented. He took out his earpiece, ignoring the frantic voices of his producers. The audience gasped. Again, this was it. This was the moment that would be remembered forever. Jack Calloway, the man who had spent decades controlling the narrative, had just given it up. Melania sat back, watching him closely, as if she knew what had just happened. Jack Calloway was no longer the same man. The silence in the studio was different now. It wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Well, the audience erupted into applause, but Jack barely heard it. His hands still trembled. His entire worldview had just been shattered. And yet, for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. He was ready to listen. He was ready to understand. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to believe. As the cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of this historic moment, America held its breath. Because tonight, Jack Calloway didn't just lose a debate, he found something far more important. For a moment, the world stood still. The studio, once filled with tension, arrogance, and the sharp bite of controversy, was now overtaken by a silence so profound it was almost holy. Jack Calloway, the man who had spent decades mocking, tearing down, and silencing others, had just removed his earpiece, severing himself from the very machine that had fed his ego for years. And in doing so, he had unknowingly done something historic. Across America, millions sat glued to their screens. The host who had never backed down had just surrendered, not to defeat, but to truth. The network's control room was in chaos. Producers shouted over one another, scrambling to regain control of what was supposed to be a routine late-night interview. But this wasn't routine anymore. This was something far bigger. "Cut to commercial, now," one executive bellowed. But no one did. Because deep down, even the network staff knew this was a moment no one dared to interrupt. On screen, Melania Trump sat with the same quiet grace she had carried since the beginning, her golden cross necklace still shimmering under the studio lights. She had not fought Jack with rage. She had not sought to humiliate him. She had simply stood firm in her faith, in her conviction, and in the truth. And in doing so, she had disarmed him completely. The audience, once a sea of uneasy laughter and whispered skepticism, now stood in stunned admiration. Some wiped at their eyes. Others clasped their hands together as if witnessing something divine. And then, it happened. A slow, hesitant sound at first. One person in the crowd began to clap, then another, and another, until the entire studio erupted into thunderous applause. Not the kind of forced, obligatory clapping that often filled TV studios, but something far deeper, far more real. This was a standing ovation, not just for Melania Trump, but for what she had just done, for the truth she had just upheld. And at the center of it all, Jack Calloway sat, staring at the desk, his hands trembling, his carefully curated career crumbling in front of him. He had walked into this night thinking he would own the conversation, humiliate his guest, and come out victorious, as he always had. Instead, he had been undone. Jack lifted his gaze slowly, looking at the audience, at the cameras, at the flood of people who were no longer on his side. His entire career had been built on dominance, arrogance, and the idea that he was the smartest person in the room. And yet, tonight, he was the one who had been humbled. He had a choice now: cling to his pride and try to salvage what was left of his reputation, or step fully into the unknown, the terrifying, unfamiliar feeling of surrendering to something bigger than himself. Jack swallowed hard. He had spent so long fighting against faith, belief, and the idea that there was something greater than himself. But as he sat there, watching the First Lady, a woman who had stood her ground without ever raising her voice, who had never once faltered under his attempts to humiliate her, he realized something. She had something he had lost a long time ago. Conviction? Strength? Peace? Jack exhaled sharply, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. And then, in a move that would be replayed for years to come, he did something no one in the audience, no one watching at home, could have predicted. Jack Calloway stood up. The audience gasped. Melania Trump remained still, watching him carefully. Jack turned to face the crowd, gripping the edge of his desk as if steadying himself. His voice, once laced with sarcasm and venom, now sounded hollow, raw, and utterly human. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. A hush fell over the room. No one had ever seen him like this before. For years he had spoken with certainty, with absolute authority. But now he was a man without answers. Melania, with that same quiet poise, tilted her head slightly. "You don't have to have the answers, Jack," she said gently. His breath hitched. For a man who had built his entire identity around knowing everything, around always having the perfect comeback, the perfect defense, this was the most terrifying realization of all. For the first time in his life, he truly didn't know. And maybe that was okay. The audience, sensing that something deeply real was unfolding, waited, breathless. Jack ran a hand through his hair, glancing down at his earpiece, the lifeline to his producers, his network, the world that had built him into the man he was today. He picked it up slowly, staring at it. And then, he set it down. The control room exploded into chaos. The network execs were screaming now. They knew what this meant. Jack Calloway was no longer playing their game. He had just taken the first step toward something else, something uncertain, something he had feared for so long, something real. Melania Trump, watching him closely, gave a small nod of approval. "Faith," she said softly, "begins when we stop pretending we have all the answers." Jack exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I don't know if I have faith," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Melania smiled, not in triumph, but in understanding. "You don't have to," she said. "Not yet." The audience exploded into applause once more, but Jack barely heard it. His mind was somewhere else now, in a place he hadn't allowed himself to visit for decades. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about ratings, or control, or power. He was thinking about his past, his choices, and what came next. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to listen. The cameras continued rolling, capturing what would go down in history as the night Jack Calloway changed forever. The studio lights dimmed, but the energy in the room remained electric. It wasn't the kind of excitement that came from manufactured television drama or forced conflict. It was something far deeper, something that no producer could have scripted. Melania Trump sat with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout the interview. She had not wavered, not once. Her golden cross still hung around her neck, shimmering under the fading stage lights. But now it wasn't just an accessory, it was a symbol of something greater. Jack Calloway, the once unshakable media titan, sat motionless at his desk. His carefully constructed persona, the arrogant host, the relentless interrogator, the man who could turn any guest into a spectacle, had crumbled before millions. His reputation, built on sarcasm and control, had been shattered not by force, but by truth. And the most shocking part? He wasn't fighting it. The silence stretched as he stared at his desk, his fingers twitching, his mind racing. The applause in the audience had died down, leaving only the sound of hushed whispers, viewers leaning to one another, murmuring in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. For years, Jack had believed he had all the answers. Tonight, for the first time, he realized he had none. Then, a voice pierced through the heavy silence. "Thank you, Mrs. Trump." A single woman's voice. Soft, but unwavering. Melania turned toward the audience, her expression warm but unreadable. Then another voice, and another. "God bless you. You spoke for all of us tonight." More voices joined in, not in shouts, not in chaos, but in a wave of gratitude. The camera panned across the crowd, men and women with tears in their eyes, some clutching their own cross necklaces, others simply nodding, overcome by emotion. This wasn't just about politics. This was about something far deeper. Jack Calloway finally lifted his gaze. His eyes met Melania's, and in them there was no longer defiance, only a quiet surrender to the truth he could no longer deny. His voice, hoarse and unsteady, broke the silence. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "But I need to find out." Melania's lips curled into the smallest smile. Not triumphant, not smug, simply understanding. "That," she said gently, "is the first step." The cameras kept rolling, capturing a moment that no one in the audience, no one watching at home, and certainly no one in that studio would ever forget. For years, Jack Calloway's show had been a symbol of division, cynicism, and the relentless attack on faith and values. Tonight, it had become something else. A reckoning, a turning point, a moment that proved conviction, courage, and faith could still stand tall in a world that often tried to silence them. As the show cut to its final commercial break, the control room sat in stunned silence, executives too shaken to even argue over what had just happened. Because deep down, even they knew. This was history. As the final moments of the broadcast faded to black, the world erupted. Social media exploded within seconds. Clips of Melania Trump's calm yet unshakable defense of her faith flooded every platform. The hashtag #FaithStandsTall began trending nationwide, with millions praising her grace under fire. News outlets scrambled to cover the fallout. Some hailed it as one of the most powerful live TV moments in modern history, while others desperately tried to spin the narrative. But it was too late. The American people had already seen the truth unfold with their own eyes. Viewers across the country, from small-town diners to city skyscrapers, replayed the moment again and again, marveling at the unyielding power of conviction in the face of public humiliation. Jack Calloway's name was suddenly everywhere, but not in the way he had always intended. His once loyal audience was now divided, with some condemning his attack on faith, while others openly questioned the ideology they had blindly followed for years. In the days that followed, a shift began. Churches saw a surge in attendance. Families who had long felt ashamed to express their beliefs in public stood a little taller. Parents shared the moment with their children, using it as a lesson in courage, integrity, and the right to stand for one's faith. This wasn't just a TV interview. This was a moment that changed something deep within the American spirit. And no one, not even Jack Calloway himself, could ignore it. Melania Trump's unwavering stand against mockery was more than just a moment of defiance. It was a reminder that faith, integrity, and courage are timeless values. In today's world, where beliefs are often challenged, this story proves that standing firm in your convictions can inspire millions. No one should be shamed for what they hold dear. If this story moved you, like this video, subscribe for more powerful content, and share it with others. Let's keep the conversation going and remind the world that truth, respect, and faith will always stand strong.